So, we have been talking about design of experiments, and one aspect of the design of experiments that's critical is understanding when you need to repeat an experiment to be able to prove that you indeed are seeing the effect that you're planning for. And we're going to revisit our moldy bread because, heck, I like moldy bread. So, at the end of this video, you'll be able to differentiate between the different types of experimental repetition and identify when running a duplicate versus a replicate is useful. Last but not least, talk about the technical and financial implications of each method with an industrial focused in particular. You can take this topic to a much higher level with some more extensive study in statistical analysis, but we're going to focus on this from an industrial development perspective. So, you went about, and if you recall our last video, we were designing an experiment thinking about intervening on introduction of a functional ingredient to prevent mold from growing in bread. And let's say we designed that experiment and it worked great and fantastic. But how confident are we that the effect that we're seeing is actually from the experiment and the treatment that we introduced, or that it wasn't just a fluke of nature and something in the environment was preventing us from seeing the impact that we wanted to do? So sometimes it's important to think when designing an experiment about what could possibly go wrong, and think about all of the potential outcomes that could come, both positive and negative. I think back to my experience in grad school, and my supervisor at Iowa State, his name is Paul Scott, he said, you know what, thinking is very cheap. Doing experiments starts to cost a lot of money, and so take the time to think things through, both positive outcomes and negative outcomes, to make sure that you have a really good plan. And once you've got that plan, go ahead. Well, what happens if your experiment doesn't work? Let's think this through and imagine all the possibilities. Was it a poor selection of treatment? Well, we'd hope that we picked appropriate treatments and we had appropriate positive or negative controls to make sure that what we're seeing is indeed the impact that we want and that we're confident in what we're seeing. Or was it a variable in the environment that threw the experiment off? I think back to my grad school days as well. And one day we were doing some microbiology. I was working with soybeans. My lab mate was working with fish. And my soybean experiments were working great. And her fish experiments were suddenly all of a sudden showing huge levels of mold contamination. And we chalked it up to the fact that that day I was running soybean samples in the same space, and my grinding of soybeans was throwing mold into the air. You want to make sure that the results that you are seeing are not just from environmental variables, but that indeed it was from the treatment itself that you're seeing this. So this is where repetition becomes critical. So what's a repeat? A repeat is where you have a full repeat of the experiment, and that allows you to mitigate the impact of external variables on the outcome of the experiment. Now, we're in a school environment, and in many cases we will cut corners and we'll set up an experiment and we'll do it once and we'll say, yay, hooray, we're done. But in the real world, you do want to make sure that you are planning for repetition, for repeats, to verify your results. Let's say, for example, we were doing the moldy bread, and one day all of the equipment is sanitized extremely well, and then the following day your crazy colleague Amy didn't clean up things well and didn't do a good job in end of operation sanitation. You came in a rush, didn't do pre-operational sanitation, run your product, and suddenly all of your bread is showing a high level of mold contamination. Well, a repeat, perhaps a third repeat, is going to help identify, was that moldy bread a fluke where some external variable was impacting on the outcome of the experiment, or was it just that the experiment was sound? So this is where repetition does become critical. Now, in other cases, you may be looking at what's considered a replicate. This is where you are doing some sort of measurement, splitting your experiment at a critical point where you think that there's going to be exceptional variability, and you want to minimize the variability of that specific point. And so, for example, if we were doing our bread experiment again, we may be making not just one single loaf, but we may be making multiple loaves of bread, and then subsampling from those multiple loaves and doing multiple total yeast and mold plates to be able to ensure that, because those total yeast and mold plates have a reasonably high variability themselves, that we are then getting an average yeast and mold count for each of those loaves of bread, and then averaging those together to find a typical contamination load at a certain point in time in our experiment. So this is where we are seeing what would be considered a duplicate or a triplicate, or sometimes even your quadruplicates, where you're splitting an experiment and doing a replication at that point. So more repetition, the more statistically valid your outcome is going to be. The more repetition, though, the more time and money that you're going to spend. Especially, this is something that's definitely worth considering for some high-cost experiments. Replicates, however, are useful when you have point measures in your experiment that have high level of variability. Replicates still are going to add cost and labor, but not quite the same time commitment. But a replicate, again, it is not going to be managing all of the variables that could be impacting on the outcome. You are splitting it at a certain point in your experiment, and variables that are upstream from that split are going to potentially confound your whole experiment. So make sure that you're differentiating between a repeat versus a replicate. And again, going back to that theme, sometimes experiments don't work, and it's important to take a very comprehensive approach. We'll have other videos about root cause analysis, but again, consider the variables within the environment that could have potentially impacted, and then also go back and do have a serious consideration about the treatment itself, because in many cases you have to reflect on where did you get that information regarding the effectiveness of that treatment. Let's say it was a salesperson who's trying to sell you a new ingredient that was just approved for use in a food product. They want to make a sale, so they're going to tell you anything they want to make that sale. What does the scientific literature say? What does some sort of competitive gap analysis say? Are you able to find this ingredient in other types of products? If you can find that ingredient, then there must be a purpose, and other organizations see the purpose of using that ingredient. So again, consider where are you getting the evidence to prove the effectiveness of your treatment, because again, if you're relying on salespeople who are trying to say, oh well, this is the next new ingredient, of course you've got to buy this and buy into this technology, well, you may be just like the kid who bought the magic beans for Jack and the Beanstalk. It's quite possible that you bought into an ingredient technology that may be taking you the wrong direction. Ask good questions. Always fun to chat with you.